Now, earlier today, we brought you our exclusive interview with the leader of the House of Commons and Portsmouth North MP, Penny Mordaunt, of course. She was asked about why she's backing a bid to build a statue that would honour the people who served in the West Africa Squadron, a naval unit which enforced the abolition of slavery, where she insisted that it's really important that we tell the whole story about our history. But should we really make a memorial of the squadron, or do you need to simply look at the bigger picture? Well, I can now speak with historian and broadcaster Rafe Heidel-Manku and actor and writer Femi Nylander. Welcome to the show, gents. Let's start with you, Rafe. Do you think it's a good idea to erect a statue to commemorate Britain's role in ending slavery?
Absolutely. I mean, I personally think that the West Africa Squadron deserves a hallowed place in the annals of British history, right alongside Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar and Drake and the Spanish Armada. It's that significant, and it's shameful, actually, that we don't have one or several in this nation right at the moment. It's actually perhaps more notable than those battles, because this was perhaps the first time in history that a nation spent vast resources doing something that was not in its own national interest, but was simply the right and the moral thing to do, not for Britain's good, but for the global good. Because, this West Africa Squadron was essentially the world's first naval police force, enforcing an end to the Atlantic slave trade by stopping slave ships belonging to other nations. Because whilst, in Britain we abolished the slave trade in 1807, but it carried on in, France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, the US, all carried on with the slave trade. Also in Africa, the kingdoms of Africa were opposed to the abolition of the slave trade because they were making a lucrative trade from enslaving other Africans. And so Britain went against all of this and expended vast resources, the most expensive example in history of moral righteousness. 2% of British GDP was spent in forcing an end to the abolition of the slave trade, the same amount we spend today on our entire defence budget. And it was also the most deadly of the Royal Navy squadrons to be in, with one sailor dying for every 9 slaves that were liberated. So it's so important that we remember this. And the squadron captured the public imagination in Britain through press stories. It mobilized the public to understand the horrors of the slave trade. So on every level, this is something we should all be celebrating. And it's a great shame that we don't know more about it in this country.
Femi Nylander, is this something that you'll be celebrating?
Well, I think, again, what we've just heard is key. The fact that people will use, we can celebrate the end of slavery, and celebrating the end of slavery is great, but if celebrating the end of slavery means positing the UK as this great moral force for stopping doing something which was one of the worst things in human history, and we need to distinguish between the end of slavery and the end of the slave trade. When the slave trade was ended, that doesn't mean Britain wasn't still profiting from slavery. People were still enslaved under Britain in the Caribbean after the end of the slave trade. All it means is that the trade of humans along the high seas then became illegal. So Britain continued to own and benefit from slaves after the end of the so-called slave trade. But the point is, if a man was to go around raping and murdering and doing all of the worst crimes in human history, all of which were part and parcel to the slave trade, which Britain led for many, many years, and then was to finish, and then years later, having never repented for any of that, having never kind of given any retribution to any of the victims of any of that, was to construct a monument to themselves, it would be a little bit weird. Britain should focus on retributing for its past crimes and coming to terms with the fact that it is only just less than 10 years ago finished paying off the debts that it incurred by deciding to pay off reparations to the slave owners when it abolished slavery and not to the descendants of slaves itself. Britain is not in a position yet where it can celebrate and say, look at us, we're a great moral force for ending the slave trade. Britain led one of the most barbaric and cruel things to have ever happened on this earth for hundreds of years, and Britain hasn't come to terms with that. So Britain should be putting monuments up to the slaves who rebelled. Britain should be putting monuments up to the descendants of those slaves, and Britain should be paying them reparations. Britain shouldn't be celebrating itself in that sense.
Okay, Rafe, over to you.
Well, quite simply, every culture in the world has had slaves. Slavery is thousands of years old. Africa had slavery thousands of years before the British arrived there. The Islamic slave trade to Africa was carrying on for centuries before the British arrived, and carries on centuries afterwards too. I mean, the fact is that, today the International Labour Organization says that 7 in every 1,000 people in Africa is a slave. 10 million people. Pakistan, global center of slavery. Britain is unique because never before had a nation tried to lead the whole world to abolish slavery. There is no example of this in human history. At the Congress of Vienna after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain ensured that a declaration against slavery was made in those peace treaties, forcing the French and the Spanish and others to sign up to the abolition of slavery against their own personal desires. It's a unique example in history where the British Empire spent the second half of its existence atoning for the sins of slavery in the first half because of that evangelical Christian movement that swept through Victorian Britain. And I don't think Femi understands how unique that was in human history. And the people of Sierra Leone would also disagree with Femi Nylander. The capital of Sierra Leone is called Freetown. That's where the West Africa Squadron took liberated slaves. And Freetown was set up by the British as a place for them to start a new life. And when those slaves arrived in Freetown, they would walk through the famous Freedom Arch and then go to a hospital to get treated and get food. Now, the African government of Sierra Leone has declared the Freedom Arch to be a national memorial, and it applied to get UNESCO heritage status for that arch, saying it was a symbol of freedom akin to the Statue of Liberty in America. And if they think that's a good way to pay tribute to the West Africa Squadron, I don't see why we can't do the same in Portsmouth, which is the birthplace of it.
Femi?
Yes, so again, I do understand my history. I know my history. And I know that the first country in the Western Hemisphere to get rid of slavery wasn't even Britain. It was Haiti. And the way Haiti did it wasn't due to some wave of remorse from, in this case, it was French slavers. It was through a violent revolution that they had to do to get back their rights. So Britain wasn't this leading moral force that got rid of slavery for the first time ever. Like slavers, like black people, the descendants of Africans who had been enslaved, and the Africans themselves who had been enslaved, went and took back their rights. And Britain was pressured. The abolition movement, yes, there were people in Britain like William Wilberforce, but William Wilberforce himself, what was he before he turned into, there's a song, Amazing Grace, was written by a slave trader. Yes, you can talk about redemption, you can talk about the idea of turning your back on crimes you've done, but you need to understand that slavery was abolished in large part because of pressure from the slaves themselves. It was abolished in large part because of people with agency themselves who had been wronged, pushing back against the people who were wronging them. And again, to give the analogy, for me to go out and rape and pillage and murder and then turn around and pat myself on the back for stopping it and for ending it, I don't need to get into the intricacies of the history. I can get into the intricacies of the history. We haven't really got time. The reality is, if you go out and you do something wrong, you don't get to pat yourself on the back, especially when you've paid off the slave owners, and you only stopped doing that in 2015, and you never paid off the slaves. Britain still hasn't actually done anything to retribute for the historical crimes of the slave trade.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. We could go on all evening on this. Femi Nylander and Rafe Hadel-Manku, thank you for joining us. A civilised and firm but fair debate on a contentious topic, the decision to erect a statue to commemorate Britain's abolition of slavery in Portsmouth by Penny Mordaunt, on an exclusive from GBNews today.